Hi, today we're talking about this guy, the F4F Wildcat. How cool is this? Hi, I'm Matthew Burchette, and I'm the Senior Curator at the Museum of Flight in sunny Seattle. And today on Curator on the Loose, like I said, we're talking about the F4F Wildcat. How exciting! I love this guy. Now, in 1935, the U.S. Navy was flying the F3F biplane fighter. That's right, our frontline fighter for the Navy was a biplane in 1935. That's kind of nuts. Well, they knew those days were pretty close to being over, so they put out an RFP, a request for proposal, for the next generation naval fighter. And Grumman and Brewster stepped up to the plate. Now, the Navy really liked the Brewster design. In fact, it won the competition. It won a fly-off in 1938. But the Navy also liked the Grumman design, but it needed some tweaking. It had some problems. One of the biggest was the engine kept overheating. That's a problem when you're in the middle of a dogfight. Well, Grumman got smart and they replaced the engine with a more powerful engine. In fact, it was so much better that Brewster kind of lost out. Now, they still had fighters on the front lines, but they were really kind of junky. So Grumman really stepped in, and the F4F was what came to the forefront. And it was an awesome little fighter for the time. It wasn't perfect, and we're going to talk about some of the issues that it had, but it was really good for what we had right then. After the Navy figured out that the Brewster Buffalo wasn't that great of an aircraft, they decided to bring in the F3F. So in 1940, these guys first started hitting the naval squadrons. And in 1941, this little guy got its name, the Wildcat. Now here's something that you may not know. You would think, and everybody usually does, is they think of the Wildcat as a Pacific fighter. We used it in the Pacific all the time. That's the only place it got used. Not the case. The British actually had bought the F4F in 1938 or 1939 and were using it to defend Great Britain. In fact, the Wildcat's combat debut was on Christmas Day 1940 when a martlet, which is what the British called their Wildcats, shot down a Ju-88. Mind blown! So the combat debut of this little guy was over Wake Island on December 8, 1941. Wake Island was on the other side of the international date line, so it was actually December 7th back in the United States. And we all know what happened on that date. VMF 211, which was a Marine Corps fighter squadron, had a dozen of these guys delivered to the island just days before the Japanese attacked. Unfortunately, all of them except for 4 were on the ground when the Japanese started bombing. So, one of them survived the bombing while 4 of them were up on a combat air patrol. That left only 5 frontline fighters for VMF 211 to use to defend the island. In about 18 days, they went from 5 down to 1. And that one plane was destroyed just a day before Wake Island fell. But it was amazing what these guys accomplished, and it showed what a quality pilot in a tough, rugged aircraft could do. Here's a little fun fact for you. By 1942, every single United States Naval Fighter Squadron was flying the F4F Wildcat, and there's a reason for that. Well, number 1, it was our frontline fighter, but number 2, it was a pretty good airplane. Now, it was greatly outclassed by the Japanese Zero, but it did have some really big advantages. By all respects, the Japanese Zero was a much better plane, but the Wildcat did have some things in its favor. The speed of the Wildcat was about 320 miles per hour, where the Japanese Zero was 346. So definitely let's give the Japanese Zero a win there. The climb rate for the Wildcat was 2,265 feet per minute, but the Zero could hit 3,100 feet per minute. Another win for the Zero. Maneuverability. Japanese Zero, way more maneuverable, had big ailerons, could really turn tight. Gotta give that one to the Zero. Now, here's where it really gets good. The Japanese Zero had no armor for the pilot or the fuel tanks or even the engine. It's what made it so light and nimble. Now, the Wildcat, it was pretty chunky, but it had tons of armor. It had armor at the front windscreen, it had armor behind the pilot, and most importantly, it had self-sealing fuel tanks. In fact, it was really hard to shoot down. Okay, 1 in favor of the Wildcat, so we're 3-1 right now. Armament. This one's kind of a toss-up depending upon how you want to look at it. The Wildcat had 4 to 6 50 caliber machine guns. That's a lot of powerful armament. Unfortunately, early models tended to jam. Their guns jammed, but we worked out a system there. Now the Zero had 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. And you would think with those cannons it would get the win here, but it only had about 160, 120 rounds for both cannons. So that's about 60 rounds per gun. That's not a lot of ammunition. So I'm gonna give this one to the Wildcat. So now we're 3-2. Fuel tanks, like I said, self-sealing fuel tanks on the Wildcat, no self-sealing fuel tanks for the Zero. We're definitely giving this one to the Wildcat. Range, 800 miles for the Wildcat versus 1,600 miles for the Zero. That's impressive, gotta give that one to the Zero. Altitude, 3,700 feet for the Wildcat, whereas only 3,300 feet for the Zero. Definitely going to the Wildcat. And that became a huge issue over Guadalcanal, and we'll talk about that in just a sec. Just like every other fighter aircraft, it's the person in the cockpit that really makes the difference in a dogfight. And our guys came up with some really interesting and effective maneuvers to take advantage of all those things that we talked about earlier that we had over the much more nimble Zero. And one of those was a diving attack. We could get way above the Zeros and then utilize our diving speed to do a hit and get, which means you come in, you hit them fast, and you get out of there and dive away, and you don't want to get into a turning fight with a Zero. The other thing was developed by a Navy pilot, John Thatch, and it was called the Thatch Weave. 2 Wildcats would literally weave, and it created a system where each of them could watch the other's tail, and it would suck in a Japanese pilot, and if he went after one Wildcat, the other would latch onto his tail, and if he went on to the other Wildcat would latch onto its tail. It was an amazing and simple maneuver, but it made a huge difference in the battle. You know, while the Wildcat may not have been the best fighter we had in World War II, the pilots that flew it were scrappy guys. Did you know that more Medals of Honor went to F4F Wildcat pilots than any other type of fighter aircraft in the American arsenal? That is impressive. 8 Medals of Honor were awarded to Wildcat pilots, and 6 of those went to Marine Corps pilots over Guadalcanal. That is impressive. And here's another little tidbit. Who would have thought that this little guy would end the war with a 6.1 to 1 kill to loss ratio? That's pretty impressive considering what it was up against. Did you know that the Wildcat flew from 1941 all the way to 1945? It's true. it flew in the entire war. Now, obviously it was not a frontline fighter for the entire war, but it saw more than its fair share of action. And we're gonna talk a little bit about this particular plane because it's not really an F4F. What? You know, the Wildcat may not have been the best fighter we had in World War II, but it served ably until about 1943 when Grumman shifted production to the F6F Hellcat. It was stronger, faster, more maneuverable, and all around a better fighter. But this guy, oh no, it wasn't done yet. General Motors picked up the slack and started building FM1 and FM2 Wildcats. And this guy is an FM2. You can tell by one really dead giveaway. This super tall tail. In fact, this plane flew in World War II off of an escort carrier called the USS Petrov Bay. And you can tell it's from the Petrov Bay by the giant clover leaf there. By late 44, early 45, the Navy went to some pretty cool designs to show everybody which aircraft carrier the plane was from. It was a visual aid to let people know where they were in battle. Now, we are really lucky to have this plane on loan to us from the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. So big shout out to those guys. Thank you very much. And thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of Curator on the Loose. If you've got questions or comments, remember, hit us up on Facebook, YouTube, or you can even shoot us an email at curator@museumoflight.org. Thanks for tuning in.